Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's press conference. My name is JP Tasker from CBC News, and I'll be today's moderator. I have here Sean Fraser, the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, and Filippo Grandi, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Bon après-midi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely honored to be joined here by my friend Filippo Grandi, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. High Commissioner Grandi and UNHCR have been amongst Canada's strongest partners in our global humanitarian efforts, and I want to deeply and publicly thank you for your support, now spanning many years. High Commissioner Grandi and I today discussed both Canada's plans to welcome visitors fleeing the war in Ukraine, as well as the country's ongoing commitment to welcome Afghan nationals to Canada. Comme nous l'avons annoncé, le Canada accueille les personnes qui fuient la guerre en Ukraine et cherchent un refuge temporaire. Working with partners, we're going to continue to do everything that we can to make sure Ukrainians are supported over the course of their stay in Canada. Since January 1st, more than 12,000 Ukrainians have arrived here in Canada. And over the past 2 weeks, since launching applications for the new expedited process, the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel, we've now received more than 112,000 applications from individuals who are seeking to come to Canada. And in the last number of days, we have now approved more than 26,500. Comme vous le savez, ce programme permet aux Ukrainiens de venir au Canada pour 3 ans avec des permis de travail et d'études ouverts qui leur permettront de travailler ou de suivre des cours immédiatement. To support Canada's response, we acted early. This includes streamlining our processing and visa requirements while prioritizing the safety and security of Canadians at the same time. To reduce the pressure on biometrics collection, we're exempting biometrics for certain individuals from low-risk cohorts, including youth up to the age of 18, people over the age of 60, as well as those who have a travel history to Canada who've followed the rules in previous visits. Again, these decisions regarding biometric exemptions have been taken with great care because we want to make sure that we maintain the confidence of Canadians that we have a process in place that both expedites the arrival of Ukrainians and doesn't compromise on the important security outcomes of the biometrics assessment. Nous continuons à chercher des moyens de soutenir les Ukrainiens et à savoir de quel soutien ils auront besoin une fois qu'ils sont arrivés au Canada, parce que nous savons que le voyage ne s'arrêtait pas à leur arrivée. Even though most are arriving as temporary residents, we announced recently that we would also expand settlement support for all Ukrainians coming to Canada in recognition of the special circumstances that they're facing. This means Ukrainians will have access to key services to help them settle into their new communities. This will include things like language training, employment assistance, services for women, seniors, youth, and LGBTQ2+ persons. But it also includes, in many instances, the soft supports that allow a person to do well after they arrive in Canada. Sometimes it's little things like making sure that people understand how to sign their kids up for a soccer club or how to ride the bus. And sometimes it's big things like providing childcare while parents are undertaking language training supports. Pour ceci, nous allons compter sur plus de 550 agences de services d'établissement à travers le Canada qui se mobilisent pour jouer un rôle clé dans le soutien des Ukrainiens après leur arrivée. I also want to highlight that starting this month, the Canadian Red Cross, with support from the Government of Canada, is providing Ukrainians with arrival packages initially at Toronto, Vancouver, and Edmonton airports. These packages include key information on supports and services, as well as information in Ukrainian. C'est ce que nous devons faire. Nous savons que venir vivre dans un nouveau pays, même temporairement, n'est pas facile. Et nous continuerons à chercher des moyens de soutenir davantage les Ukrainiens après leur arrivée. I want to make clear that notwithstanding the enormous effort that we're putting behind Ukraine, we also remain extremely committed to helping those we've made a commitment to in Afghanistan. Last week, I had the privilege of greeting a chartered flight at Pearson International Airport with nearly 300 privately sponsored refugees. This marked an important milestone in Canada's resettlement initiative with respect to Afghanistan because it marked the arrival of 10,000 Afghan refugees since the beginning of the humanitarian crisis. I should also point out that earlier today, an additional flight arrived in Calgary with more than 330 Afghan refugees who will now be given a second lease on life here in Canada. In fact, when I was in Calgary just a couple of weeks ago, I had the good fortune of bumping into a recently arrived Afghan refugee on the street who recognized me and wanted to say thank you to Canada. After a short conversation and an expression of gratitude and a hug to welcome him to our country, 90 seconds later, he found 7 or 8 friends who arrived on the same flight and came running down Stephen Avenue. I used to live in Calgary, and I'm attached to the city. And it's a moment I'm never going to forget. These are people who just got out of quarantine. It was, I think, their first or second day that they were actually allowed to explore Canada. And I was one of the first people they bumped into. And it gave me faith that we're doing the right thing to make a substantial commitment to those who've fled the Taliban in Afghanistan and are now living in Canada. Being able to welcome personally those who arrived on the plane at Pearson last week, it was an incredible moment. I put it into perspective for myself. 10,000 people. I live in the town of New Glasgow. There are fewer than 10,000 people live in the town of New Glasgow. To think of my entire community is represented in the scale of the people who've already arrived in Canada, and that we're going to continue to go to 40,000 is extraordinary to me. But what really stuck with me is the fact you see kids. When you're a parent and you see kids the same age as your own kids, who might not remember what it was like to live under Taliban rule. I've had the chance to meet a number of kids who've come to Canada as refugees that are adjusting to life in Canada the same way that my kids are. And it's an extraordinary thing to see the difference that this program is going to make in their lives. The stories of these newcomers don't end with the arrival of an airplane. They come to Canada in communities large and small that are welcoming Afghans with open arms. Nous avons aidé encore plus d'Afghans à arriver rapidement et en toute sécurité au Canada pour commencer leur nouvelle vie, et nous sommes déterminés à atteindre notre objectif de réinstaller moins 40 000 réfugiés afghans en 2 ans. I want to emphasize that we remain seized with this effort and are going to continue to work with provinces and territories, resettlement and settlement service providers, private sponsors, and other stakeholders to welcome additional Afghan refugees. Je tiens également à souligner que le Canada n'est pas le seul pays à s'engager à développer de nouvelles initiatives pour aider les réfugiés qui viennent chercher refuge dans notre pays. Today, we had the opportunity to join leaders from other nations around the world and international organizations to launch an exciting new initiative that I'm very proud of, and that's the Global Task Force on Refugee Labor Mobility. And I'm very honored that Canada is serving as the inaugural chair of this task force. We're going to engage with global stakeholders from government, businesses, NGOs, and civil society to increase the number of skilled refugees that are welcome to Canada while decreasing labor shortages where Canada needs it most. This initiative builds off a groundbreaking program that is born and bred here in Canada. The Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot, or EMPP as we call it for short, is a program that recognizes the skills and abilities of refugees and allows them and their families to immigrate to Canada through existing economic programs. What it really allows us to do is level the playing field for refugees who are forced to flee their countries through no fault of their own by providing an alternative pathway to Canada. And this pathway is complementary to our resettlement efforts that allow Canada to do even more to help some of the millions of displaced people around the world. So it's over and above the existing humanitarian commitments that we've made. Through the EMPP, we're on track this year to resettle over 500 refugees, but I do have the intent to significantly expand this program in the years ahead to attract thousands of more refugees or displaced talent to Canada while upholding our proud humanitarian commitments. I've seen this program work in my community. There's a long-term care facility, Glenhaven Manor. It's 5 minutes from my home. There's a cohort of employees who were trained as health professionals abroad who happen to be refugees, but they were brought to become healthcare workers in our community through economic streams. They're allowing my friends' parents to receive care in the community where they have lived for many years. These are people who are making an enormous difference. I think to myself, despite the fact that we've recovered more than 112% of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic, before the Omicron variant landed in our communities, there was over 900,000 job vacancies. The opportunity that we have before us to use this program to change the way that the world thinks about refugees not just as people who are in need of assistance, though they are very much that as well, but people who can make an immense contribution to our communities, make our communities more vibrant and dynamic places to live. This is the opportunity that is staring the world in the face, and Canada, as part of this global task force, is going to seize this opportunity. En élargissant ce programme, il sera plus facile de faire appel aux talents du monde entier tout en offrant refuge sur le Canada pour les réfugiés. Overall, as High Commissioner Grandi and I think will agree, the actions that I've discussed today continue Canada's long tradition of humanitarian contributions around the world. They demonstrate our ongoing commitment to sharing responsibility for the world's displaced and the world's persecuted. Again, it's an absolute honor to have High Commissioner Grandi visiting with us, and I'd now invite him to say a few words. Thank you. Merci tout le monde.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre, cher Sean, et merci à tous d'être venus à cette conférence de presse. C'est ma troisième visite au Canada en tant que haut-commissaire pour les réfugiés. Et je suis ravi d'être ici. Il y a eu une période où voyager n'était pas simple, donc je suis content d'avoir pu reprendre le chemin de Ottawa, et je suis là pendant quelques jours. Je serai ici aujourd'hui et demain, ensuite à Toronto pour d'autres initiatives et rencontres. And for me, it was very important to be able to visit Canada again, because, as Minister Fraser already mentioned, the partnership between Canada and the UNHCR has been and continues to be a very important one. We just met with the Prime Minister, and I told him that, I became High Commissioner just after he was elected Prime Minister the first time at the end of 2015. And since then, as the head of an organization that has to face huge challenges, I have really been able to always count on Canada for support. Canada is one of our 10 top state donors, with, in the last couple of years, an average of about 100 million Canadian dollars contributed to UNHCR. This is a sizable contribution which has been growing in the past few years, and this really helps us support refugees and displaced people around the world. And of course, Canada is a very important resettlement country, and Minister Fraser already spoke about different aspects of its resettlement program. During the past few years, when the US government reduced its resettlement program, it was Canada that kept resettlement alive as a solution and option for refugees. And I want to really take this opportunity to thank Canada. We're very happy that now the United States are back with a very sizable resettlement program, but we could keep in place the structures and the programs because of Canadian support and Canadian persistency and sustained management of the resettlement program. It was the Syrians. I remember in my first visit here, the 25,000 Syrians that came. Minister Fraser mentioned the Afghan resettlement program, in which we are also cooperating. It is now not a resettlement program, but the hospitality that is given to Ukrainians. But let's not forget, resettlement is also about many other populations or many other refugees in distress, particularly vulnerable in many other places. So that's very, very important, and I want to commend all these initiatives. I would like to add that, of course, with the Prime Minister and then in other government meetings, I have and will continue to discuss some of the most acute humanitarian and refugee crises around the world. Up to the 24th of February this year, my organization counted 84 million refugees and displaced people around the world. You all know that since then, that number has probably grown to well over 90 million. We must be in the region of 95 million now. We haven't the latest count, but you know that the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion and the war that has followed, and the exodus of people both outside, 4.3 million people that have fled from Ukraine into neighboring countries, and the more than 7 million that are displaced inside, make this the fastest growing and most dramatic refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War, as we have already said many times. And I'm grateful to Canada for the support that it is providing, also through my organization, in helping refugees, helping displaced people inside Ukraine, and trying to find solutions for them. I have recently visited for the second time Poland. Previously, I had also visited Moldova and Romania, some of the most affected countries. This time, just last week, I was able also to enter Ukraine and visit Western Ukraine, where the displacement situation is very serious. We have seen a decrease in recent days of the outflow of people, most likely because Ukrainians are watching very carefully the evolution of the military offensive and of the war. It is also possible that if larger parts of Ukraine go back in government control and are stabilized, that we will see also some people going back. But the scenarios remain very open. Many people are asking me, what do you think, more people will come? We don't know. This has been a very unpredictable situation, and I think we need to be flexible in our response on the humanitarian side to help people where they need to be helped. And this includes, of course, Ukraine itself. We have large programs there together with other humanitarian agencies, and it includes also those cities that are besieged and bombed and isolated. You have certainly followed the very, very excruciating negotiations that the Red Cross and the United Nations humanitarian agencies are conducting to have access to those places, to bring supplies to desperate people and to help those that want to get out of those traps, literally, in every way we can. Very, very challenging work, very difficult to get guarantees that those convoys will be secured, but we will continue to do that in the spirit of helping people where they need to be helped. Now, of course, and this was a message that I passed to the Prime Minister and to the government of Canada, not that they don't know that, but I think it's useful collectively to remember that we cannot forget all other crises in the world. Afghanistan is one. I was also very recently in my second visit to Kabul after the Taliban takeover in last summer in August. And of course, and even beyond Afghanistan. Yesterday I was in New York. I met the ambassadors of the African countries to the United Nations collectively, and their message was very strong. Please don't neglect us. There's many crises in Africa, humanitarian crisis. There is a need to sustain development assistance. There's a need to address the devastating effect of climate change, and this has been a strong message to the Prime Minister, which of course was very well heard and very much agreed with. And I was very pleased to learn just this morning that the government of Canada has approved a substantive contribution to humanitarian activities in the Sahel region of West Africa, and including activities to address forced displacement. And I think this is really important. I know it's asking a lot to countries with resources, but we live in a very challenging world with many different challenges. We're just emerging from the pandemic. We have now the Ukraine crisis, and an important point to make is that everything is connected. You know very well that the crisis in Ukraine, the invasion and the war in Ukraine are already causing enormous problems on food supplies around the world, on energy supplies, with an impact that is particularly felt on poor and fragile countries. So dealing with one crisis doesn't mean that we need to neglect the others. On the contrary, we need to have a very interconnected approach to all these different challenges. I am also grateful to the government of Canada for the attention that it continues to pay to humanitarian and displacement problems in Central America. This is a point that the Prime Minister just raised with us, reaffirming the commitment of Canada to contribute to initiatives that are meant to address, on the one hand, problems of violence in Central America that displace many people, but also economic and social problems that require large investments in order to offer people alternatives to unnecessary migration. So I'm very grateful. We have, UNHCR has an initiative in that region, not a big initiative, but an important one, and Canada is one of its main supporters and will continue to be. I want to conclude by saying two things. One is that to join Sean Fraser in applauding this initiative of labor mobility for refugees. This is a fantastic initiative. As I said at the launch of the group that will lead this initiative this morning, this afternoon, the message is refugees carry more than their suitcase, carry skills, carry innovation capacity, enthusiasm, eagerness to belong and contribute, and this initiative covers all these important points. So I hope actually that it will be scaled up and replicated in other parts of the world, and we will find ways to do that. And finally, to say that this is a bit personal, if you wish, but I had an immense privilege this morning to be invited by Minister Fraser to a citizenship ceremony. It was a virtual one, but I said this to the Prime Minister just a few minutes ago. It was one of the most moving events that I have ever witnessed, perhaps because I deal with uprooted people, and I have dealt with uprooted people for 40 years almost now. To witness the moment in which they're not uprooted anymore and become citizens of a country where there is freedom and prosperity and hope was and will remain one of the great moments for me in my life. I'll never forget it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both for your presentation. We'll now take about 20 minutes of questions. If you have a question, line up at either of the mics on the sides of the room here. If you're on Zoom, please raise your hand and we'll try and get to you after we work through the people that are here in the room. So we'll start with David Aiken at Global News, please.
Thank you. David Aiken, Global News. Hi, Commissioner, Minister, good to see you both. Thank you for taking our questions. You referenced that Canada is dealing really with two big refugee crises right now, Ukraine and Afghanistan. Recently, I've been speaking to a lot of advocates for Afghanistan refugees, advocates for those trying to get over here, advocates for those here. And they are worried that Canada may not have the capacity to deal with such two huge crises. So I wondered, Minister, if you could address that concern, that we don't have the capacity to deal with these two crises. And High Commissioner, I wonder, you just mentioned 84 million displaced people to nearly 95 million displaced people. What does that do to your organization in terms of trying to help so many people and so many new millions of people all at once? The capacity issue, gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks.
Thanks, David, for your question. And of course, the challenges facing immigration in Canada are not complicated only by the two humanitarian crises that you've mentioned, but also by the challenges that we've seen that stemmed from the impact of COVID-19 on immigration, both from the impact on our operations at offices around the world that have been shut down due to public health measures in other countries where people don't necessarily have the ability to work from home the way they did in Canada, but also the decision to pivot towards welcoming more permanent residents who were already in Canada at a time when the borders were closed while applications kept coming in. There's never been more demands on our immigration system in Canada. But to answer your question, when I think about do we have the capacity to make good on these commitments, I don't think we have the capacity not to. We made a commitment to people on the basis of a moral obligation that we hold in Afghanistan who've made a contribution that was significant and enduring to Canada during our mission in Afghanistan. And Canada is a country that doesn't go back on its commitments. I'll park my thoughts on the value that these newcomers are going to bring to our country because I've addressed those in my remarks to a certain degree. With respect to Ukraine, I think to myself, these are people who are willing to lay down their lives to defend the principles of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of self-determination of peoples, the very right to choose who gets to have a say in decisions that impact your lives. We don't have to fight on the front lines of a war on the other side of the world to defend those values at home. One of the things that we can do to ensure that our allies in Eastern Europe and across the European continent continue to have the capacity to absorb people who are seeking safe haven is to take some of that responsibility in Canada. We have an extraordinary Ukrainian-Canadian community. 3% of Canadians claim Ukrainian heritage. There's people in need, but they're people who can be well supported in Canada. It's going to be a challenge. There's no question. The challenges are unique. In Afghanistan, the challenges are driven less by the capacity of our department and more by the fact that the territory has been seized by the Taliban, a listed terrorist entity in Canadian law. Securing safe passage, even for those who've already been processed by our department, is still enormously difficult when you're seeing what life is like for them on the ground. With respect to Ukraine, we had the opportunity to start preparing in advance. As of January 19th, we struck up an internal task force at IRCC, and that early planning is starting to pay dividends. I've mentioned we've now created a new program that's approved 26,500 people to come here, but that's in addition to the people who were approved under the expedited processing we had in place for others. The fact that we set up early, not just by getting people at the ready, but sending people and resources like biometric kits into the region is making it easier for us to handle this. And we built the system through our visitors regime that has the capacity typically to process 2 million cases a year. So is it a challenge? It's an enormous challenge. We're asking the system to do more than it's ever been required to do at a time when it's already facing pressures. But can we do it? I don't think we have a choice but to do it.
Before I answer your question, just to strengthen what Sean just said a few moments ago, you know, for not here in Canada, but in Europe, for many years, we heard the argument that it was impossible to take refugees, too difficult, too many, too complicated. You know, famously, Chancellor Merkel in 2015 said, it's not true, we can do it. You know, she said, wir schaffen das, we can do it. And to me, that remains, you know, that has remained a guiding slogan for me in dealing with governments and say, if there is a will to help people in extreme distress, there is a way to do it. And what Europe is doing today with Ukrainian refugees by giving them what they call temporary protection, which is a very expedited way to take them into the different countries. What Canada is doing through visitors program approach demonstrate that when there is a will, there is a way to help people in expedited way. At the same time, I know that there's been a lot of discussion here in Canada about, you know, too slow process for the intake of Afghan refugees. At the same time, it's important, especially when it comes to resettlement, to safeguard these process to ensure that they are fair, that the right people are benefit from resettlement, and that you don't rush it in a manner that makes it unsustainable. So you have to strike a balance always between urgency and at the same time integrity and sustainability of the program. And just to say that, you know, I salute Canada's commitment in all these areas, and my organization will continue to be a partner in these efforts. And to your other question, big challenges. You know, we are moving towards maybe having 100 million uprooted people around the world. We thought that it will take many years to get there, and maybe we would never get there. But unfortunately, this war is getting us closer. And what does that mean? It means that mobilizing resources becomes more and more difficult. It means that you know, we risk having some of the crises forgotten and neglected, and these are issues of great concern to us. Now, on the resources, one point that I would like to make, and we'll discuss this more tomorrow with Minister Sajjan as well, is that what all these crises show, the interlinkage between conflict, climate, inequalities, In the past, it was more straightforward. You have a humanitarian crisis, you respond with humanitarian resources. Today, you have to work in an interdependent way. We work, for example, more and more with the World Bank. We never did before, because we want to address some huge development issues. You know, the Prime Minister of Poland told me in my first visit there after the beginning of the war, he said, yes, we need humanitarian assistance, but we also need to start thinking how to include hundreds of thousands of children in our schools. Even a European country has to think about how to strengthen its education system to absorb this huge influx. And all the more so countries that are poorer and do not have those resources. So that's the resource challenge that we're facing. But the other one, and I conclude, the other big one is, of course, the other big concern that I have is the paralysis of conflict resolution mechanism. Look at what's happening in New York at the Security Council. And unfortunately, Ukraine has put this crisis squarely on the table of world leaders. And I do hope that at least one silver lining of this tragedy that is consuming itself in Ukraine will be a reflection on how, you know, collectively we revitalize peace mechanisms that are failing us big time and are failing these people that then, for whom then we have to resort to aid or resettlement or other emergency measures.
Thank you very much. A follow-up for Minister Fraser. So we received some memos that your deputy wrote in August to your predecessor, Minister Mendicino, talking about the response to the Afghanistan situation. It was a situation caught everybody kind of by surprise. And in it, Deputy Minister Tapley said to Minister Mendicino, we're going to have to take some resources away from our other lines of business to put them on call lines and other things to deal with Afghanistan. So similarly, again, this is Afghan refugee advocates. They're worried that that's what happened when the Ukraine crisis came out of nowhere, is your department had to take resources away from other lines of business, other programs to deal with Ukraine. Can you speak to how internally you would have managed to keep up with all you were doing on Afghanistan and then bring on all this Ukrainian stuff? Because last time around, it's pretty clear resources had to be diverted from existing programs, causing slowdowns in other immigration streams.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's an important one, and I think you got to appreciate when you ask a system to do more, it requires you to respond and reallocate resources in a short term if you're dealing with an emergency. But to be absolutely clear, the resources are put in place to ensure that you can accommodate those adjustments you've had to make. So the Prime Minister announced with respect to Ukraine a $117 million contribution to stand up the programs that we've now put in place to make sure that we're able to backfill those resources to ensure that we don't compromise the outcomes that are so important to Canada's interest, whether it's from a humanitarian resettlement point of view in Afghanistan or the ordinary operations of our immigration system. We're not just putting more money at it. We've actually been borrowing staff where we can from other government departments to make sure that we're accommodating to whatever extent possible the need to respond very, very quickly, while at the same time making sure we put a plan in place to backfill those resources so we don't compromise outcomes. In the days and weeks following a crisis emerging, certainly there can be a short-term impact. If you're asking the same worker to do twice as much, that's not a sustainable or fair way to operate. But we do accommodate that kind of a situation by putting resources in place, so we're not asking the system to do more than it can handle given the resources available to it.
Mylène Couette, La Presse, à vous la parole.
Bonjour, Monsieur Grandi. J'aimerais savoir, avez-vous des attentes assez précises, par exemple, sur le nombre de réfugiés ukrainiens que le Canada devrait accueillir pour aider les pays européens qui les ont accueillis déjà?
Je reçois cette question tout le temps en Europe également.
Ah oui.
Et je pense que pour l'instant, l'approche la meilleure est d'offrir aux réfugiés ukrainiens, là où ils sont, des mesures d'accueil flexibles. En Europe, ça s'appelle la protection temporaire, qui permet aux réfugiés d'aller là où ils ont des connexions, des familles, Et c'est le même principe qui est adopté ici, si je comprends correctement, avec l'approche visiteur. Je ne connais pas le nom technique, mais c'est un petit peu la même approche. Donc, l'initiative vient des réfugiés eux-mêmes et tout cela est bien parce que ça évite des discussions sur des quotas qui sont toujours compliqués et ça favorise l'intégration au moins temporaire de ces personnes parce qu'ils vont là où ils ont déjà des attaches, des connexions, des familles. Donc, je trouve que pour l'instant, je recommande et nous recommandons, le HCR recommande au gouvernement de garder cette approche, disons, un peu plus libre initiative ou libre marché. Mais il faut offrir des mesures légales qui le permettent, évidemment. Donc, je pense. Les quotas, c'est complexe. Et puis, comment vous définissez combien de réfugiés doit prendre le Canada? On peut dire, il peut en prendre 20 000, et puis peut-être qu'il n'y a pas 20 000 personnes qui veulent rester ici, mais 20 000 qui veulent aller ailleurs. Donc, c'est compliqué, c'est artificiel, et ça ne résout pas la question, tandis que les autres approches, pour l'instant, fonctionnent bien. Et dernier point important, tous les pays limitrophes de l'Ukraine, principalement la Pologne qui a pris la majorité qui a reçu la majorité des réfugiés, apprécie cette approche parce que ça a déjà permis à beaucoup d'Ukrainiens de bouger dans d'autres pays et d'alléger la pression sur les pays limitrophes. Donc, c'est très utile.
Au début de la guerre, des avocats en immigration me disaient on ne croit pas qu'il y en aura beaucoup qui vont vouloir venir au Canada parce que, bon, ils vont avoir tendance à aller dans les pays limitrophes, comme vous dites, dans l'espoir de pouvoir retourner à la maison éventuellement. Là, la guerre s'éternise. Donc, est-ce que vous pensez finalement que le Canada va jouer un plus grand rôle que ce qu'on attendait au départ?
Je n'ai pas de statistiques. Je n'ai pas une réponse scientifique à votre question, n'est-ce pas? Parce que nous n'avons pas fait une enquête sur les intentions de destination des personnes. On est dans cette crise depuis quelques semaines seulement, n'oubliez pas. Mais je suis sûr que, et nous savons qu'il y a des réfugiés qui ont des connexions ici. Le ministre vient de le dire, il y a une importante communauté ukrainienne dans le pays. Et donc, inévitablement, il y aura des gens pour lesquels la solution, ne fût-ce que temporaire, idéale, c'est pour ça que c'est très important que cette mesure d'accès rapide, flexible, soit mise à disposition, parce que certainement, je ne sais pas combien, mais il y a des gens. Vous savez, c'est aussi important qu'il y ait une solidarité internationale et non pas seulement européenne. Et je suis sûr qu'il y a aussi beaucoup d'Ukrainiens, je sais, qui ont des connexions aux États-Unis, par exemple. Et donc, que la même approche soit prise par d'autres pays. On a déjà eu des ouvertures, même de pays de l'Amérique latine, où il y a des communautés ukrainiennes. Donc, il y a une très grande... C'est assez admirable, tout ça. Il y a une très grande solidarité mondiale, et je pense que c'est bien. Et si je peux ajouter un point, je reviens un petit peu à ce que j'ai dit tout à l'heure. L'Europe, prenez l'Europe par exemple, qui a toujours résisté un petit peu à l'accueil des réfugiés. C'est pas comme ici, c'est beaucoup plus difficile en Europe, même des pays qui repoussaient les réfugiés. L'Europe, en un mois, a accueilli 4 millions de personnes et a établi des mesures qui ont permis à ces pays et à ces personnes de s'éparpiller dans le continent. Alors, c'est possible. C'est possible de le faire. C'est possible de le faire quand les États travaillent ensemble, et en unité, et développent des mesures qui permettent à ces mouvements de se passer dans la légalité, dans l'ordre et d'une manière plus contrôlée. Donc, je pense que nous apprenons des leçons importantes que, j'espère, vont être appliquées à d'autres situations également.
OK, la prochaine question est pour Pascal, TFO.
Oui, bonjour, Pascal Vachon, TFO. Minister Fraser, I want to ask you about the FCFA and other Francophone organization yesterday. They asked the federal to increase the targets for Francophone outside Quebec to 12% in 2024 and 20% in 2036. Knowing that we haven't been able to reach 4.4 since 2003, do you think that 12% in 2-3 years is feasible for Canada?
Merci pour la question. Selon moi, c'est essentiel pour augmenter le nombre de nouveaux arrivants francophones. C'est une bonne chose pour notre pays. Ce n'est pas juste un enjeu pour Québec. FCFA est très important dans ma province, la Nouvelle-Écosse. parce que les communautés acadiennes veulent d'accueillir beaucoup de nouveaux arrivants francophones. Nous introduire les projets de loi pour protéger les poids démographiques francophones au Québec, au Canada et au Québec, mais nous faisons des investissements pour soutien les agences et établissements. On a ajouté des points dans le système express-entrée pour améliorer l'application pour les personnes bilingues et les francophones. These measures are starting to have an impact. I do expect, after several years of work, to work towards the goal of 4.4%, that we're going to be able to achieve that. I welcome the report. We now need to do some deep thinking on what we need to do. I think the starting point for me is that c'est essentiel pour notre identité culturelle de protéger et promouvoir la langue française. It's as somebody who grew up Anglophone and started speaking French in the last couple of years from nothing. I was always proud of our linguistic duality in Canada. To know that we had linguistic diversity in our country is something that strikes at the very core of what it means to be Canadian, and to prove that people who have a distinct history can live alongside one another in pursuit of a better federation is something that I was always inspired by. We need to be very careful because we have huge ambitions when it comes to growing Canada through our immigration system. If we don't manage the demographics of that ambition, you could easily see how an increase in the overall number will erode the presence of francophones in Canada. And c'est inacceptable. We need to think about what measures we need to put in place. I'll point to one that I'm pursuing now, is to je cherche flexibilité dans le système d'expression-entrée pour sélecter des francophones avec des compétences, des enseignants francophones, des healthcare workers, people who are going into francophone communities where they'll have access to school for their kids, to childcare in their language of choice. These are the kinds of things we need to do. So I hesitate to say, let's jump to the target before I understand the process of getting there. It's similar in a lot of ways to the pursuit of reducing our emissions on climate change. Targets are important. They're an essential component to a plan, but they are not in and of themselves a plan. I want to satisfy myself the best possible measures to protect the French language and the French culture in Canada, because to me it strikes at the very core of what it is to be Canadian.
You say you want to put new programs in place. We look at the first number from this year, 2022. It's only 2.2% of Quebec. It's a long way up to 4.4. When can we expect a turnaround? Because Francophone are asking for a turnaround. When will we at least be able to go to 4.4? Will it be this year?
I think you'll see an increase this year with the numbers, and I think I wouldn't judge too quickly early in the year. There's some unique things going on in our immigration system as we come out of the pandemic. The inventory of people includes folks who may have been entitled to come and claim permanent residency, but for whatever reason chose not to travel, potentially because of the public health situation. Over the course of this year, I expect that you're going to see an increase. Not just over last year was a unique year with a pandemic that had an impact on francophone resettlement in Canada. But if you go back to the year prior, we were at 3.6%, and I expect you'll see a continued trajectory. And we put in place in collaboration with FCFA over the last number of years to hit it by 2023. So I think you'll see an increase this year compared to 2 years ago, and then achieving the target of 4.4 by next year. I wouldn't read too much into the first 12, 13 weeks of this year in terms of the outcomes you expect to see, because we do have, nous avons une inventaire plus grande avec des personnes qui avoir l'habilité fini le processus d'immigration du Canada, qui est francophone. If we put in place some of these extra measures, it'll make it easier for us to make sure that we're pulling out francophone newcomers who are already in the system, and I think that's going to make a huge difference. So I have a lot of confidence that we'll exceed the level from 2 years ago and put us on a pathway to hit at least 4.4 next year, and then we'll look to continue to grow from there.
I know you folks have to go, but there's only one person left in line. Would you be willing to take one more question? Yeah.
It's okay for me. I'm looking around the room. If nobody's pulling me out of the room, I'm usually okay.
It's only Rafi.
Yeah.
Rafi
Only
Buchanan.
Rafi.
CBC News, you go ahead.
Thanks very much. The first question is for High Commissioner, although, Minister, if you want to jump in, feel free as well. More than a year ago now, I believe you put out a framework for how governments can consider bringing in more climate refugees and specifically sort of, help out people trying to escape from climate emergencies. Canada does not have one yet. I believe it's not the only country that doesn't have one yet. But can you speak to how urgent it is for countries to be acting on this?
There are no such thing as climate refugees. Let's be very clear. There are people that are forced to move by different causes. Climate plays a role in that increasingly, for example, in the Sahel. But, refugees are refugees. There is a definition, and refugees, and I think it would be risky to change that definition in a world that, in a political context in which we may get a narrower definition as opposed to a broader one. What I think needs to be done, sorry, I'm being technical here, but it's important, is to consider that many people that flee in part at least for climatic reasons, have protection needs that are covered by many international legal instruments. And the Global Compact on Refugees, I don't know if you were referring to that, recognizes that and encourages government to consider this. In most cases, there is a bit of a misconception. There are people that flee because of natural disasters. There is a flood, there is a drought, and they move to another areas. Are they refugees or not? These are different from people fleeing war, but they have their own needs and necessities, and this needs to be met. In most cases, in case of natural disasters, people want to simply return to their homes and reconstruct their homes or be able to cultivate their fields. So that's one set of issues. Very frequently now, and this is more, I think, germane to your questions, what is happening is that climate becomes a cause for conflict. I am going in a few weeks to Chad in West Africa. Why? Because Chad is receiving people from Cameroon, nearby country. Why are these people fleeing? They're fleeing because there is a conflict between different communities. And why there is a conflict between different communities? Because climate change has deprived those communities of basic resources. And when poor communities are deprived of resources, very often there are tensions between communities, and this is causing an exodus. Are these refugees? Of course they're refugees. And are they covered by the various conventions? They are. So it's a complex issue, this definition. So what we are telling all countries is, this is not so much a resettlement issue. This is an issue of what do we do to prevent these movements, this forced movement of population. And this is what I said earlier in responding to another question. This is not simply a humanitarian response that is needed. What is needed here is look at the deep causes that create this forced population movement. We need to address, fundamentally, we need to address the climate emergency, reducing emissions. I mean, I don't need to give you all the list of things that we know we should be doing, and we're not doing. We're not doing enough. But then there is also a development element, and there is an element of conflict resolution that also needs to be strengthened. So it's very complex. I'm sorry that I cannot give you a straightforward answer, but to create a category of climate refugee and say these people, this is not the right way to go. I think it's more complex than that, and we do have the instruments, and we need the resources to address it.
Look, hard to follow that answer. Look, the very first time I ever got involved with any kind of an official organization, I was 7 years old in grade 2, and I ran to become the vice president of my environment club at my elementary school. I've literally been a climate activist my entire life, marching in the streets in my little events in my hometown, and of course, a few years ago, had the honor to serve as parliamentary secretary. The point that I really want to drive home that the High Commissioner just made is that if there's a vulnerable person who's fleeing their home country now as a result of a multitude of factors, including climate change, that person should be eligible based on their vulnerability. Whether you need to have a branding exercise around climate change, I question. That said, this is going to become a bigger issue. So we need to be watching very closely the impact of climate on the movement of people. There will be some instances where climate change leads to conflict that causes people to become displaced. There will be other instances where there is a natural disaster that demands action. If things continue to worsen, there may be people who live with long-lasting droughts, sea level rise, etc. If they're vulnerable, they're vulnerable. If they're vulnerable because of climate, they should qualify for refugee programs. To the extent we need to save specific spaces, I would just want to make sure that we're not taking away from other programs that would bring people based on their vulnerability. But certainly if someone's fleeing because of climate-related factors, they must be eligible based on their vulnerability, not necessarily solely because of the climate aspect.
The High Commissioner and the Minister really do have to go now, so we'll have to cut it off there. Thank you.
Look, apologies. I saw there was one more question. If we want to follow up afterward, I hate to leave people who wanted to ask a question, but we've got an appointment, so please don't be shy to get in touch.